Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. Welcome to this session 6 of our international teachings, the fracture sessions brought to you by the Transnational Institute, the Alternative Information Development Center, NOR, the Asia Europe People's Forum, and associated organizations. The world is changing. We have seen changes in the international world order. We've seen what seems to be the end of neoliberalism. We've seen the rise of the far right. We've spoken about this in our last sessions. And amidst all of this, we have seen a growth in a political system and an economic system that seems to be at war with the planet that we live in, seems to be at war with life itself. So amidst all these changes, amidst all these fractures that we're seeing, how can we save our planet? How can we save this planet that we call home? Welcome to this session. We've got an amazing lineup of panelists who are going to help us to really figure out this problem and see what are the opportunities that are there for movements, where is the light coming in, and how can we save a better future for mankind. Very many thanks to my colleagues and partners who are helping in the background, Nick Buxton, Jess Graham, my colleague Lavinia Steinfort, who's going to join us later in the panel, and all the TNI resources that have come together to make this possible. I'd like to introduce to you our amazing lineup of speakers who are going to be giving us their insights today. First, Julia Steinberger researches and teaches in the interdisciplinary areas of ecological economics and industrial ecology at the University of Lausanne. Her research looks at the current and historical linkages between resource use and socioeconomic parameters, identifying alternative development pathways to guide the necessary transition to a low-carbon society. She is a lead author for the International Panel on Climate Change and the recipient of a Leverhulme Research Leadership Award for her research project, Living Well Within Limits, investigating how universal human well-being might be achieved within planetary boundaries. We're looking forward very much to hearing what she has to say. Tasneem Essop is the Executive Director of Climate Action Network International, the world's largest climate network made up of more than 1,900 civil society organizations in over 130 countries. She served 2 terms, a total of 10 years, as a commissioner in the National Planning Commission in South Africa, where she led the work on climate change and the just transition. She is founding director of the Energy Democracy Initiative in South Africa, a qualified teacher and former trade union organizer in the Confederation of Southern African Trade Unions. Maureen Santos, our third speaker, is a coordinator of the Politics and Alternatives Unit of FASE, a non-governmental organization in Brazil dedicated to rank-and-file labor and grassroots community organizing. She's also professor in the International Relations Department of PUC Rio University and coordinator of the environmental platform at BRICS Policy Center, a think tank of PUC Rio. She works on environmental and climate justice, international trade and movement building. She represents Grupo Carta de Belém in the political committee for the People's Summit towards COP30, and also represents that coalition in the technical working group COP30 created by the Brazilian government. She's extremely busy these days, so we're very grateful for taking her time to come and speak with us, especially in the run-up to Belém. I'm going to introduce my colleague Lavinia Steinfort a little later when she comes in to reflect on the presentations by our speakers. First, I'd like to ask our speakers, please speak slow. The audience has said they really prefer if they can follow what's going on. But for the audience, if you really can't follow what the speakers are saying, there's a transcript, a show captions button at the bottom of your Zoom interface. So click on that, and maybe reading along to what the speakers are saying will help you understand. Before we get to our speakers, though, I'd like to find out from the people that are in the audience, people that are joining us. Thank you for saying hello in the chat, telling us where you're joining us from. But let's have a quick poll. Let's try to understand exactly where we stand let's get a sense of the sentiment in the audience. Please pick one option. We know all the options are somewhat valid, but please just pick one and tell us what is the principal reason you think the world's political leaders have failed to deliver climate justice. Please choose one option. Is it that fossil fuel interests have been too powerful? Is it that our politicians have short-term visions tied to elections and they won't make the tough decisions? Is it a fundamental contradiction to our capitalist growth economy? Or the climate movement has failed to persuade the public? Is it an internal problem with the movements? Just tell us what you think. And this will inform essentially how we understand. And if you didn't chime with any of the options, please just explain in the chat what is the one reason we're missing that you think climate justice has not been achieved. There seems to be a clear winner. So fossil fuel interests may be very powerful, politicians may have short-term visions, and maybe as the climate movement we could communicate better. But the general sentiment in the room is that it is in fundamental contradiction to our capitalist growth economy. Hence, indeed, system change seems to already be immediately at the forefront of what we have to do. Thank you so much for your responses. Add more responses in the chat. But let's get into it. Julia, I'm going to start with you. What, in your opinion, is the state of climate policy today? Like, how far are we from climate justice? And is the picture all bad from what it looks like, or are there any signs of hope that you see? Where are the fractures of light coming in?
Thanks so much, Sean, and Nick, and everybody at TNI. So I am quite interested to see your previous, to catch up more on your previous talks, because I think for me, we're not seeing the end of neoliberalism, and I think that that's something that we have to face when we're looking at what's happening in climate policy. And I guess one of the ways I would describe it, I mean, there's the classic arc of struggle of Gandhi, which is first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, and then maybe you win or maybe you lose. I mean, you don't always win. And I think in this case, we could sort of have the ignoring phase. That was sort of when climate policy was considered a bit apolitical. It was just a scientific and technocratic matter. Let's call that the early 90s, perhaps. And then they laugh at you. That's been the age of disinformation and denial. And that is very much driven, in fact, by the fossil fuel interests. As we know, it's industrial disinformation. And they've really managed to stop climate being taken seriously and climate justice being taken seriously. And the way that they've done that is through neoliberal think tanks. Now, this is something I wasn't aware of until very recently. It was really through the reporting of some people like Amy Westervelt that this became clear. But I think that the point is that now we're very much in now they fight you stage. The now they fight you stage is very clearly the petrostates taking over climate diplomacy. One of the things that's interesting within the IPCC is we even have authors, lead authors, people in various roles within the IPCC who work for the fossil fuel industry. So even in the scientific arena, we have those kinds of presences. But now in the diplomacy was taken over, by Egypt, by the United Arab Emirates, and then by Azerbaijan. And that's basically 3 years of civil society being shut out and the COPs being used to push the industry interests. And this is obviously a complete disaster. So this is very much the overt fight, where basically the overt fight is coming out into the open. And I think that this question of the growth economy and capitalism versus the fossil fuel industry, these two are not in fact separable. If you look at the way that the fossil fuel industry and the fossil fuel fortunes have pushed certain economic ideas into our society, I think that these two, you really see that neoliberalism and the fossil fuel industry, for instance, in the person of Charles Koch and in the functioning of the Atlas Network think tanks, which are active all over the world, hundreds of them, very active in Latin America, very active in Europe and Asia, more and more active in Africa. What the kinds of ideas they've been pushing, including economic education at very basic levels, they've really been trapping us in our current system. And in terms of the advance of climate justice, that basically means that the forces pushing the climate catastrophe are also the forces pushing economic inequality and wealth accumulation. And what that means is that, I guess the glimmer of hope here is that the two forces, I'm hoping that the climate movement takes this seriously. I'm hoping that we really become educated, not just about capitalism in general, or about the technological solutions and potentials for climate change action, that are entirely compatible with justice. I mean, that's the good news, right? The good news is we have all the technologies we need, we could deploy them, and we could result in better lives for everybody while not wrecking the planet. These things exist. However, it does mean lower inequality and eliminating that, overconsumption. So we can put that to the side and discuss it later. But I think what's really, really important to understand is that economic and social injustice are facing the same adversaries. The fights against economic and social injustice are facing the same adversaries as the fight for climate action, the fight for climate justice. So we are really facing the same adversaries that have been working together since the 1980s, so for the more than 4 decades, in order to impose a certain economic order and to impose a dependency on their product of that economic order. And we need to understand who they are and how they're operating. And I think that one of the really hopeful things, I guess, is for the climate movement, the climate justice movement, and the scientists looking at it, that would be my community, to really pay attention to these mechanisms, to these actors, and expose them much more strongly. And so I think that that's where I would like to leave it for this conversation, is that we have a convergence of obstacles, of opposition from economic and industry interests that are not, in my view, separable. And maybe the idea that neoliberalism is dead comes from certain aspects of the ideology not being respected, but the ideology was always flexible. It always followed the funders. So I think we need to understand what this has now turned into and where it's heading in terms of the actors and the organizations still pushing it. So that's where I will leave things.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Julia. So indeed, in our previous sessions, we may have started with, the question was, do we live in a neoliberal world? And I think how you phrase it right now is essentially where we got to, because it might be changing, but is it dying? We're not really sure. And thank you so much for highlighting the idea that there's a convergence and unity in the foes that we're up against. Which leads me, I think, to the question I have for Tasneem, which is, our foes are united, as Julia has already has pointed out. How do you assess the state of the global climate justice movement on our side? Where have we made progress, and where have we failed?
Thanks very much, Sean, and greetings to everybody, and thanks to TNI for the invitation. And thank you, Julia, for sharing your reflections. I'm going to start out with a bit of a response to, not a response, but just to add to what Julia's been saying. Completely agree that where we are in terms of the arc is the fight back, the system fighting back. And again, to remind ourselves that in fact, the system itself did not, Julia, this is, I suppose, in the climate space, we can talk about the 1980s, etc., when it really becomes sharpened, the foes or the adversaries. But there's a history, a long history of, from colonialism through to capitalism, neoliberalism. And one of the things that we have been always aware of, I hope, is that the system is absolutely capable of adapting. The second feature of course, is the ability to remain united and united against the adversaries. So let me pivot to the climate justice movement. There's a mixed bag. There's been gains and there's been setbacks in recent years. I think the most important gains that I would reflect on is, of course, that the climate movement, the climate justice movement has become far more coherent and cohesive in terms of its understanding that what we are fighting is in fact a system and systems. And that the parts of that Julia also referred to, the parts of the climate movement who in the past saw our struggle as just being about carbon molecules, about reducing emissions in a very narrow sense, those parts of the movements, while they exist still, the majority of the climate movement understands that we are united in fighting the system that has caused the climate crisis, but also other crises that we are up against. So I think that is an important element of progress. I can say, for example, our network can, in the past, wasn't part of a climate justice movement. We've now, you know, in the recent years, been very firmly entrenched within a wider climate justice movement. And in addition to that, what has happened recently as well is that the climate movement has formed alliances with other movements. So they don't operate in silos any longer. We've formed alliances, for example, with movements that deal with debt justice, tax justice, with movements that's dealing with human rights, et cetera, et cetera. So certainly that united building of the movement has happened quite strongly in the recent years and is actually an important area of progress. And also, of course, it's not just the fact that the movements are united, it's what's happening on the ground. And you would know that there have been gains in recent years. We've understood that there are fights on the front lines by local communities, indigenous peoples, whether that's against pipelines or any extractivist activities. We've witnessed protests on the streets and, of course, Fridays for Future, really escalating all of that in around 2018, 2019. There have been successes in litigation as well. And, of course, regional fights that's happening. So not just at local level, regional fights like Don't Gas Africa, Don't Gas Asia, and now I believe, Maureen, we're going to have Don't Gas Latin America or Don't Gas the Amazon, etc. So regional fights, and then of course the global fights. And this global building of unity, building from the local to the global has been, I believe, a really important area of progress. Now, what are the setbacks? And I think one of the things, it's both a setback, but in fact, it is also an important, I suppose, fracture, if we can call it that. What has happened, of course, now, and it's from COVID, it became clearer and clearer, the system has exposed itself, right? Of course, we've had the iron fist with a velvet glove, and that velvet glove has come off for all of us to see. COVID demonstrated the real injustices, the inequities in the world, and especially between global north, global south, where, of course, clearly global south lives didn't matter. It was pretty dispensable in terms of sharing the vaccine and having vaccine equity. But we also now, today, the system, the violence of the system itself has been laid bare. And this comes off the back of a genocide that we are living through and unable to stop. And so that violence has featured in many different ways, right? We have seen, interestingly enough, the kind of repressive response in countries that have been believed to be democratic. So in the West, in the UK, Germany especially, etc., there have been violent repressions against protesters, interestingly enough, of two forms, against climate activists and against those who are fighting a genocide. Literally fighting, those fighting two existential crises are the ones being most repressed at this time. That's a serious setback for the movement, although the movement is more and more, courageous in terms of taking on the forces, the adversaries. Our adversaries are not just the fossil fuel industry. Our adversaries are the very state machinery, of course, with the hands of corporate interests, of oligarchs, of the fossil fuel industry behind it. So certainly we're living through a period where all of this is being made far more visible, which gives us the opportunity to understand what we need to do, what our responses would need to be. And the final point I do want to then pivot back to, Julia, is, of course, yes, the petrostates are playing far more important roles, but we also have to be clear that in all the history of diplomacy in the multilateral space, it has actually been the global north that has resisted any change. We've had a US forever blocking and obstructing, and now, of course, finally Trump withdraws yet again. And many of the other northern governments who also have been obstructive, they're not leading in terms of reducing their emissions, they're not providing climate finance, which is essentially a climate justice issue. So certainly, yes, the petrostates are rising in influence, but so too are global north countries continuing to extract, continue to expand their fossil fuel production and exploration, and not taking seriously the obligations they have in terms of the convention itself. So we have a mix of course, the petrostates emerging and becoming a bigger influence, but we should not forget, and this is the important injustice, global north countries have a responsibility in terms of, a historic responsibility in terms of addressing the climate crisis. And they have a historic responsibility to provide the finance to the global south, which is a means to also ensure justice, and they're just not doing that. So, but yeah, to conclude, the climate movement is a mixed bag right now. It's a fight, it's a struggle. We win some, we lose some, we move forward. The most important thing is to maintain the collective power of our movements across the world. Thanks, Sean.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tasneem. Thank you for that very clear-eyed analysis and description of what we're seeing globally in the climate movement. And indeed, even as our foes are allied and united, I think we are seeing cross connections happening now, even just on social media, right? You're seeing different movements that have been operating separately now kind of speaking with a similar voice and coming together. And I think that's what we really need to work towards strengthening and making sure that we align together and push back against our united fronts. We're not outnumbered, we're out-organized, movement leaders have always said. But you spoke about resistance at the local level and resistance at the global level, and it's good that you ended on that note with speaking about the historical duty that global north countries have. And one of those one of the spaces in which this has been mainly highlighted is at the United Nations. And thankfully, we've got Maureen today on our panel. Maureen, you're organizing towards the next United Nations climate talks in Berlin in September 2020, in November 2025. What's the state of play as we approach COP30? Like, how is Brazil's government responding both domestically and internationally? And what are the key struggles and demands that we're seeing at this upcoming summit?
Thank you, Shab. Thank you, TNI, for the invitation. Hello, everybody. Happy to be here. Yeah, we are in a moment that you were saying that's like a challenge, and at the same time we saw as a very important opportunity to be together, to gathering, because you don't have for a long time this possibility for the international, the global civil society. And at the same time, being Amazon, it's very also emblematic because everybody talks about Amazon, but not everybody stepped in Amazon before. So be there, be with the organizations and the grassroots from the region. It's also be very important to have a better picture about what means also when you talk about local climate justice movements. Some of them even use this name, but they really, their struggles and their resistance is also part of this agenda of the climate justice. We are in a moment of the structural and logistics plan that was not too easy in Belém, as you know. In the dialogue with the government is also not fluid as we want. We started this process almost 2 years ago in 2023. So we get time enough for to build unity nationally with the social movements, the unions, the family farmers, peasants, indigenous people's organizations, traditional people's organizations, women organizations. So It's a very diverse process. And we're building the People Summit that we're calling to now towards COP30, but as soon as possible, you have to use and change this name because we're almost there already in our way. But the first moment and the first issue that I think it's important to bring about this approach, it's that we talk about a process. We're not talking about an event. No, I think maybe this is different than the other People Summit that you have in the past or other forums, because you really wish to these political gains that you get in Belém. At that same time, everything that's been building until there should be something that you can do concrete key actions in the future. We are working a base of convergence process. We have 6 axes of convergence, and since like half of last year, we internationalized the process. So like Tasneem is part from CAN, we have the CJ, you have a lot of other groups that's from the political committee. And at the same time, you have working groups that debates different kind of actions that's part also of this movement building. At the same time, this convergence methodology decide 6 axes after a long time of meetings and discussions and debates that can connect a lot of topics that the civil society organizations and are talking during all this time. So for me, this already is a very important advance, because instead of you are working in small boxes, you are trying to push a big movement that's not only related to climate agenda, it's much bigger than that. And we are connecting issues like for example, the X1, it's about territory, alive territories, and I don't know how can say that in Portuguese, is maretórios, that's related to people from the sea, the traditional people, food sovereignty and popular sovereignty. This is the first one. The second one is about historical reparation, struggle against environmental racism and against the false solutions and political power and corporation power. The third, it's about just and popular and inclusive transition. The Act 4, it's against the oppression, for the democracy, and for the internationalism of the peoples. This one is very important because you are looking for all this debate of denial of the extreme right power, everything that's happened like in Palestine with this genocide. So it's a very important topic that you should push stronger. The X5 is related to just cities and live urban peripheries. And the last one, the 6, it's about popular feminism, resistance of women in the territories. So in all of these, we were doing, we just left a meeting some days ago, me and Tasneem are in Belém, and we advancing some methodology in a program, because the People Summit is autonomous, is in parallel of the official COP30, and it will be between November 12 and 16. So as we are bringing this building process as civil society autonomous from the government, of course, there is some difficulties and conflicts during this relationship, because Brazilian government are used in this current mandate to build process that they call social, whatever the name of the event, you know. So this social event, it's related to the government offering a space to civil society in the official event. But really you don't have this historical trajectory of movement building in the People Summit. You really want to do something in parallel outside, and can push an agenda that's not possible to include inside the UNFCCC, exactly because the points our colleagues Julia and Tasneem already said about. So we really hope that this, although all the difficulties that we're having the way, especially related to support, because the government, there is a very, very difference between the treat of civil society inside the government. Even if the president Lula said that it's a government for social participation, but there is ministers that doesn't agree with that and do what they can to create troubles for us to realize this or to hold this process in November. So I think it's my time.
Yeah.
So we keep talking.
Thank you so much, Maureen. And thank you so much for the great work that you're doing together with all the movements to actually prepare this the People's Summit. And I can understand indeed all the difficulties that you're facing with the internal politics of the Brazilian government, but also at the same time linking with civil society internationally and all the tensions that arise there. I was speaking with Tasneem earlier, and she mentioned also like the difficulty of some other global South civil society movements to participate in Berlin, and maybe that's something that can come up also in the second part of this conversation. Thank you so much. To the audience, everybody who's listening in, instead of a second poll, I would love to hear your thoughts already about what you heard in this chat so far, what you've heard in the chat. Could you please, maybe having heard this analysis and what our speakers have had to say, how do you think activists and movements should respond to this fractured moment? Like where the climate crisis is becoming ever more apparent, but political will seems extremely weak. How should we respond? Please share your thoughts in the chat, and we will try to pick up good ideas from there. Also, always to share with the rest of our movements and to facilitate the thinking that's going into the resistance against the fossil fuel industry and the old allied foes that we're coming up against. Maybe then let's come back to you, Julia. You've heard what all the other folks have had to say. From your perspective, how should anyone concerned with climate justice navigate this moment in terms of strategy, tactics, and in particular messaging? And particularly, how do we address the backsliding of neoliberal politicians on climate action everywhere in the world? We're seeing everywhere backsliding in climate action. Is there a way of doing that and still keeping open our push for systemic change?
So I think the push for systemic change is ever more obvious because these politicians are behaving in very anti-democratic ways. So, and I saw in the chat that Quinn Slobodian was one of the people that you had the discussion on neoliberalism with. So he's one of the historians that's really showed how the current economic system, and of course Tasneem was absolutely correct. It doesn't date from yesterday. It has colonial roots. It has colonial present behavior. But we have its current manifestation, and its current manifestation is to maintain inequality and wealth accumulation for capital at the expense of everybody else in very anti-democratic ways, because democracy is the big threat here. Democracy comes with claims for redistribution, it comes with claims for social justice, and it comes with claims for, safety of a very basic kind, as in not destroying the planet. And so I think that it's never been easier to tie these stories together and to explain how we face, how the vast majority of humanity really has common interests in a way that maybe has not been the case before. So I think that the case for what we're facing is very clear, but it's not communicated clearly yet. And the fact that democracy and democratic rights stand at the middle of it, that's not necessarily clear as well, because sadly the disinformation of the fossil fuel industry has really been so successful in really trying to convince people that climate action is in fact a massive issue against democracy and democratic will. So I have to change rooms right now. I'm really sorry. I'm on the road, as I said. So I'll pick back up. I'll pick the discussion back up in the next place.
Okay. Thank you so much, Julia. Yeah, and indeed, what we're seeing is indeed a coordinated pushback against the climate movement. And I think the global north, global south divide also brings in a very specific angle to it. I would say to maybe Maureen, I'd like you to address this from your experience in the global south, like both as a movement representative and in how you engage with the government, like Brazil, which is on the left, but also divided and politically weak, it seems. In addition, could you say something about any lessons you have on how to push back against far-right climate denialism, such as we're seeing with Bolsonaro and today with Trump?
We saw also this moment that we have right now as it's a moment to talk with the public opinion, locally, because of course the other organizations internationally is also doing that, because in global south, it's not only for Brazil, it's also in global north. There is a huge wave of these extreme rights and changing. It's not only one extreme right, but you have different inside of one with different also perspectives. Some of them much more radical and bring the craziness idea. The other one is from the changing system, but bringing the system with the at the same time with dialogue with the neoliberalism. And we are living today days that the parliament is taking up the agenda, not only the agenda, but also the budget from the executive power. So as before you have the state divide more clear about the executive parliament and the judiciary in Brazil, right now the parliament, it's getting much more power related to the budget of the state. So we have, during the Bolsonaro government, and also because the extreme right and the groups that belong, as you call here, centered, and the parliament that go for the one that have power at the moment, to be in the middle. But if it's the extreme right, the government go much push for them. Now it's a Lula government, they push for a little for Lula, and these groups, it's creating a lot of hard difficulties for us here, not only because some of them bring more visibility for this climate denialism, even if they are not Congress women or men that's related to the extreme right, but they dialogue very well because they're only thinking about votes and only think about keeping them in the power. But for other hand, we also are suffering again a very deep process of the step back environmental legislation that happened also during the Bolsonaro government. Just one example, in the last week, we had passed in the Senate, in the Chamber of Senators, a law that changed all our environmental licenses for big, how can I say that? Big projects, for example, hydroelectric power plants, thermoelectric power plants, mining, or also like business. And with this project, we will destroy this process of licensing and the monitoring and the regulation by the states. Now, with this project of law, they just put as an automatical approve. And also the licensing it's like a simple document that the company that wish to do the project, they do it by itself. So it's not anymore a licensing made by the state with the organisms that with the states to monitor the process. And you already have in Brazil 2 big tragedies related to mining companies. For example, Mariana and Brumadinho, we call by the name of the cities, when the dams of the mining was broke and then invades the cities and destroy rivers, and also kill a lot of families, and the way of the life, the peasant. There was huge impact for peasant agriculture and for indigenous people from the region, for traditional communities. And until today, you don't have a real judgment against these companies in Brazil. And there is all the debate. There is also families that didn't come back to the place they are on or didn't receive anything yet. So there is a long, long list of problems related to that. And with this change, you have getting worse in this process. So it's crazy that you can think that in the year of COP30, that to be in Brazil and should be a year that the country and the state of Brazil, the government supporting this agenda for more environmental protection, for the climate protection, they are supporting the agenda of these groups to destroy our environmental and climate law. And I can tell you that this votation was very emblematic because it was unanimity. So even the senators that support or is part of this government, the government Lula, they vote in favor of this law. So there is an agreement between sectors of this government with this politics. And for us, this is a very scary thing because even they don't feel constrained about COP30, they don't feel that anything that the pressure of civil society, and this for us is the worst thing in this moment. So you don't need only a Bolsonaro. You can have process like that during a popular and democratic government too.
Wow, thank you so much, Maureen. I think this ties back to what Julia said at the beginning, right? That we are now in this phase of actually the system fighting back. And I think part of that fighting back is what we're seeing, where it seems like we're in a phase where all the different protections and the movement gains that had been made are being stripped apart and being pulled back. It's like we're accelerating towards the precipice rather than actually bolstering sort of like the different mechanisms that we had already come up with to slow down what we can see is an apocalyptic future that awaits us. So it's really strange to see. I don't know how people think that way, but maybe that is why it is our duty as the movements to really make sure that we put those back up. Tasneem, you've heard what Julia and Maureen have to say. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what they said. And also to ask, like, what are the new and particular strategies that global climate justice movements are using to address this moment? Like, what are the fractures or the possibilities of new alliances that could sort of break open possibilities for climate justice? Because as Maureen just pointed out, we really do need them, don't we?
Yes, thank you, and thanks very much. And really just to follow from Maureen, and that was the example of Brazil, but the example of Brazil would be the same examples we're experiencing across the world. We can talk about, you know, in most countries, our governments, not just the northern governments, but our governments in the south, literally backsliding or following the path. You know, they look to the north for their economic aspirations, etc., the models of economic development. They pretty much bought into the kind of neoliberal models of economic development, of growth, etc. So we do have, and it's becoming more brazen, more emboldened. And I believe that this kind of brazen, emboldened behavior, the sense of impunity, also flows from the impunity that we are witnessing through the way Israel has conducted its genocide, the smashing of international law, the dismantling of multilateralism, and sheer violence, of course, across the world. So certainly the context in which we're living through right now allows for impunity of all kinds, including impunity when it comes to climate action or not taking climate action. Now, I think that the important thing here, of course, and flowing back to what Julia said earlier about the arc, where we are, the fight back, that we have our own arc. And if we're talking about dismantling the system, dismantling the capitalist system, the imperialist system, and some people in the questions I see raises the issue of having an anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist revolution, then this is not a shortcut. And in our own arc of history, our anti-colonial fights, our anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist fights, in that arc of the fight, it is important for us to go back in history and learn from those struggles. There were, really good lessons to be learned, and of course, where we failed, we have to learn the lessons of that as well. So certainly do not think that we're starting off a blank slate, that this is new, we have history behind us, we need to learn from that history. So where we are on this arc, of course, is interesting because, we could be in this phase while neoliberalism might not be dead, but are we at that point where we're witnessing the last kicks of a dying horse? And if the horse is dying, I used this metaphor before and I shouldn't, but it's not anti-animal, so please forgive me, it's just a metaphor. We should be doing the best we can to smash the system, basically, right? If it's dying, we need to be using our power to smash it. And that's not easy. One of the important things out of the history of these struggles is that it took organizing of people. Not just the protest on the street, not the kind of tactics that we use now on a regular basis, but that has to be backed up by real organizing of people. So in the questions that people are asking, how do we persuade people, to, working class, etc., it's only through engagement and organizing. Do not leave people to be used and captured by forces in the world. So the right wing, for example, I know we have a tendency to dismiss the right wing as if it's a homogenous group of people, but no, we have to go and drive wedges. Because in the end, when you strip things out, ordinary people, working class people, people living in poverty, etc., we need to understand what drives them in terms of their needs, their insecurities, etc. And one of the tactics that the climate movement is using, or strategies that we think would be a helpful entry point to reach those constituencies, is the just transition, and centering justice, not just in a climate sense way, but centering justice across the board. And just transitions and the processes of just transition potentially helps us to reach all these sectors of society. Someone mentioned the yellow vests, for example, and we know that there was a big farmers' protest in the EU last year. In any case, why? Because we haven't been engaging with those constituencies. If we engaged constituencies and sectors of our society, looked at how they can participate in the processes of planning for a just transition that would take care of the needs and interests and protections of those vulnerable sections of our society, that would be a form of winning people over and hopefully persuading them to the agenda of both an anti-capitalist fight, but also, to the climate justice struggle as well. And so that is one of the strategies we have adopted. I don't know, Sean, if I have, how much time I have. I want to describe a tactic that we've adopted in recent years. Can I just do that?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay. So in the past years, recognizing, and I know people are saying, why should we participate in the COP, etc. You don't ever give up space. Never cede up space to anybody, especially our adversaries, and they would love us to give up that space. So what we did, because we work in the multilateral space as well, we decided around the Glasgow COP at the time of COVID and all of the suffering that we were witnessing and experiencing, that we could not go to that COP with an agenda that wasn't going to speak to that suffering. And so what we then initiated is something we call the escalation strategy, and essentially pulling together our collective power in all of the movements, building wide coalitions. We choose one fight that we will all put our energy and weight behind and fight till we get a result. And so we chose the Loss and Damage Fund as our fight, because we believed that financing losses and damages, because that, in addition to COVID, in that year, of course, there were massive disasters across the world. And if there wasn't a Loss and Damage Fund, there would be no justice served. And so while it wasn't on the agenda of the COP, we put it just through our sheer power. We made it an issue that they couldn't ignore, to the point that the G77 plus China put forward a resolution, the rich nations blocked it, and we carried on fighting, and we won that victory the next year. Now, this was after 30 years of negotiations. It took civil societies, collective power. So we build power, and we need to know how we use our power. That is critical. And we've been doing that subsequently. We also did that with fossil fuel phase out, managed to get language in a COP decision for the first time ever, governments agreeing to transition away from fossil fuels. And of course, we know that's just language in the text. The fight doesn't end. We need to continue fighting. So I think where we are at now is that the movements need to recalibrate and figure out in this context how we build power and how we use power so that we can, succeed in pushing back, even if it's not, we're not going to have the revolution immediately, but every pushback against the adversaries matter. And so that would be just a reflection on what movements need to do now. And the big alliances, of course, the new big interesting alliances that I should mention is that with the genocide itself, there has been far more opening up of alliances with the groups, anti-militarization, etc., pro-Palestinian, solidarity groups, etc., and the climate justice movements are active in that as well. So the alliances are broadening beyond just the limited climate movements themselves.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tasneem. And indeed, for already kind of broaching that subject of what is the point of continuing to participate in these spaces. I think we already saw a question, excuse me, in the chat. And maybe we might come back to that in a little bit more detail when we get to our Q&A section. But TNI works a lot on issues such as this, on climate, and in particular, you just mentioned right now the just transition and how that can bring people along. I'd like to bring in my colleague, Lavinia. So Lavinia Steinfort is a political geographer and feminist eco-socialist based at TNI, the Transnational Institute. She's the coordinator of our Public Alternatives project with a particular focus on energy transition and democracy. Her publications include Reclaiming Energy, a report on how to rethink our energy system, and the 2020 book, The Future is Public, Towards Democratic Ownership of Public Services. Lavinia, I was wondering if you could respond to what you've just heard from the perspective of working with energy justice and energy transition movements globally. How do you see the situation, and what do you think are the most effective strategies for advancing climate justice today?
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, and thanks everybody for their great contributions. So I want to start with a few observations to kick things off, really building on what was shared so far, because I think in many movement spaces, it's getting increasingly clear that we need to build counterpower, right, to fight the climate crisis. So counterpower is much more at the center. And to rally such mass support, we need to figure out a pathway that really combines a reduction in emissions with immediate improvements to people's lives, to people's everyday lives, right? So many movement groups are, I think, feeling the urge to go beyond exposing the harms of the current model, and are seeking more bold, ambitious alternatives that really tie the climate and the economic justice together. So that is exactly, I think, what the many groups, what the many struggles to reclaim energy and build public power are about. And this is basically the recognition that we need to match our system critique with system level solutions. So from here, I would love to bring a little bit some hard evidence that we have been gathering at TNI to make sense of these struggles to reclaim and build public power. Because today, it's clear that most energy is produced and sold to make a profit, right? So because of lots of public finance, this has indeed led to a growth of renewables, but also still ever rising fossil fuels. And of course, we heard a lot of content already that shows that is still the case. And in fact, the bottom line is that we're dealing with an energy expansion instead of a transition. So how does this look like? Well, from China to Germany, It's the private sector that only invests when their profits are secured by public funds. And these dry up as soon as public subsidies, or in the times of the energy crisis, prices go down. So after the crisis, when energy prices go down, we also see investments disappearing. And just to put a figure to that, so UN climate finance figures even evidence that it takes $4 in public finance to get just one single dollar from the private sector invested. So it just shows how skewed the current system and our neoliberal transition policies are. And this way, governments are just throwing our collective wealth at the private sector for their huge profits, while we could be investing in public electricity utilities directly so that these have the capacities to turn a transition into reality. And maybe just to go a little bit deeper, and all of what I'm saying is really based on years, decades of coalition, of building cross-movement coalitions between trade unionists, climate justice groups, feminist groups, and you name it. So, so far, our diagnosis have been that campaigns are often still focusing on either cutting fossil fuels or increasing renewables. But to do both at the same time, we really need to take the whole energy infrastructure in our own hands. And we see people across the globe doing that. So, but also to say the proof is in the pudding, right? As virtually every country that is leading the transition, with many harms, right? This is not a utopia. There are still so many things to fight in these places, but in these places, we see that a publicly owned renewable energy company is driving the process, and that under public, which is important in order to have those immediate wins for people's lives. And then maybe just zoom a little bit out to show that in the Public Futures database that we have been building and hosting with the University of Glasgow and Public Services International, that altogether around the world, about 400 countries and communities have been reclaiming energy as a public good. But also, there are no silver bullets, right? There's still ruthless exploitation and even more and more exploitation happening in the name of an energy transition. So just transitions, as was perfectly laid out already by Julia, by Maureen and everybody, just transitions will always require an ongoing struggle for dual power. And maybe just to put a bit of meat to what I mean with dual power, which is that we can only transform our energy model from within the state and from within public utilities when we also have that social movement power to make these institutions walk the talk. So from that perspective, better public ownership is really a precondition and, let's say, our best shot for more accountability, for more affordability and democratic control. So this way would actually have, you know, the power, broadly speaking, to bring down those emissions as rapidly, as equitably as possible. And maybe to really talk a bit more strategy, how to turn public power into those actual energy democracies, and to make it a bit more concrete, because we have been seeing trade unionists in every continent, basically, demanding public utilities to get rid of their profit mandate so that they can stop unnecessary extraction and stop unaffordable bills that really push millions into energy poverty till this very day. So I think this is really about popular governance against corporate and authoritarian capture, so really to put the two together. And one of those strategies we have been seeing in these different struggles and alternatives are public-community partnerships that really marry state ownership of energy with localized decision-making. So to force governments to start sharing power and resources with communities and democratize the energy model on every level, because within energy and climate movements, to be very honest, public power and community energy folks have been fighting each other over what is the right skill, even though we really need to work across skills, right? So in order to bridge that divide, and also looking at the data, it's quite clear that energy communities often only thrive as part of a countrywide system, while at the same time, of course, state-owned utilities must be responsive to people's needs and also to the impacts of their operations on the ground. As we have seen how indigenous peoples, rural communities are fighting for more accountable utilities in, for example, Costa Rica, which is, I think, a model where many can learn from. And also really to make sure that public power struggles are not pitted against, but truly defending people's rights to land and self-determination. And as was already mentioned, right, the struggle for a free Palestine and for a global energy embargo on Israel is really the most important and urgent case in point that needs our support, that needs our constant fighting to sewer those ties between with fossil fuels and colonialism. And maybe to wrap things up, if you want to know more about this, we have been building as a kind of ongoing process, as Maureen was describing it, the Energy Democracy Declaration, to really understand how we need to have these difficult conversations between the different movements and within our movements, so that we bring different rights holders, constituencies together to tease out the tensions, to interrogate our visions, and really to come together. Besides that, I would say, if you're already active, and probably many of you are in climate and energy groups, please do start talking ownership and start organizing for public, accountable, democratic ownership as a core strategy to turn people power in really post-capitalist public futures. So I'll leave it there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lavinia, for setting out this vision for post-capitalist energy futures and really showing the centrality of, I think, energy as a key part of where the movements have to struggle. And also setting out the Global Energy Declaration where people can come and participate in this global movement. I'd like to open up for Q&A. If you've got some questions for our speakers, please add them in the Q&A section. We might not get to all of them, but it might be possible we can also use them for upcoming sessions. I'll come to you, Julia. There's a couple of questions that are in the Q&A from Adele Tuford and Alistair Alexander. I'd like to sort of combine those two, because Adele asks, like, the more we talk about systems change, all roads keep leading to the need for global anti-capitalist revolution, including in the global south. But how do we do this amidst the perverse comfort and wealth of the majority of the working class within high-income countries? I think it's a question of motivation there, right? And then at the same time, how do we sell post-growth or degrowth to working people in the North and the South? And I think that might also be a question of, you as scientists, you work in research, perhaps it's also about the communication of maybe the benefits of these approaches.
Sure.
Would you have a response to that?
Yes, well, obviously I don't have a perfect response, otherwise we'd already have a revolution and we'd be talking about how we organize our perfect lives. And that would be a different conversation, a very lovely one to have. So I think that here what I have is, and I am a scientist, so what I can say from the basis of the science is that we know that good lives without economic growth are not only possible but necessary, because economic growth is taking us into more unequal and frankly cataclysmic futures. We also know that growth cannot account for increases in, for instance, like life expectancy internationally. It just doesn't do it. Like, there are other factors at play, like, health services and sufficient food and things like that. And we know that very recent research, which is very cool, and I'll link in the chat, is that need satisfaction decouples well-being from economic growth. So if you have an economy that focuses on satisfying everybody's needs, that's the right focus, and you don't need economic growth on top of that. Overconsumption does not get you anywhere. Inequality does not get you anywhere. So I think all of these results scientifically make a very strong case for degrowth and post-growth. Now, then the question of Alistair and Adele is, people are very comfortable. They think the current system serves them, and it's hard to convince them differently. And I think that there are caveats. I think that, once again, there's a lot of propaganda going around. Once you explain to people, if you can corner somebody in a bar or in a coffee shop or whatever, and just have a frank conversation about what's actually happening and who the system really is serving, people are not happy about it. People in the global North want more climate action. In Switzerland, we just had an entire village obliterated by climate change. Our politicians, especially from the far right, which is the majority, not the majority, the largest party, have been telling us for decades, hey, don't worry about it. We're fine. Switzerland's going to be perfect. We won't have any impacts. We had an entire village just like boom, within a matter of days, gone. So this is a real shock. And I think that people are waking up to climate shocks, to climate impacts. They're also waking up to the reality of a more and more predatory and unequal, economic system, whether it's from the COVID or now under Trump within the US, that people are really suffering from lack of economic security, from precarious working conditions, the gig economy, and the giant, massive wealth inequalities. So I think that people are not as comfortable as it might seem. They're truly worried. They don't know what to do about it. They kind of want to believe the story that the system works as is. But I think that this is something that if we communicate better and if we manage to bring, I think the difficulty is there's 4 elements of the story to bring together. One is it's not your fault per se, because there's a lot of guilt, and guilt doesn't help anybody. It's not your fault. This is something that a few wealthy people have been pushing for decades/centuries, and we're caught in this, and we need to mobilize to change things. And then also tell them about how they've been doing it, which I think really is necessary in terms of climate denial, climate delay, and all the propaganda apparatus, and as well as buying politicians and corruption and so on. The second part of the story is we are not selfish pleasure seekers, because that is part of neoliberal propaganda that people have bought, including many on the former left. I don't know how you call it left anymore. Hook, line, and sinker. People really believe humans are selfish, pleasure-seeking machines. And that's not true. Like, we have so much science showing us that we are massively cooperative, massively altruistic, and that we really have a capacity to come together to form egalitarian societies and make decisions together. And that's the kind of democracy I'm talking about. And I think that is also the kind of democracy that we just heard about in terms of creating alternative democratic institutions of common ownership, and I'd go beyond energy into housing and all the other sectors as well. And so, and I think the third part of the story is that we can act on climate, we can do it fast, and we need to do it, and we can do it in ways that preserve well-being. So, and we can demonstrate the science there. And of course, because I'm super tired and I'm trying to, I've forgotten the fourth part. But I think that we have to bring these different parts of the story together, as well as North-South convergence, as well as reparations. We have to bring these aspects of the story together and turn it into something very convincing. And that's hard, to be honest. So we need different people to try it out in different ways. But I think it's becoming, people are less and less comfortable, even in the global North, even in professions and communities that used to be consider themselves prosperous and benefiting from the system. I think that people are quite uneasy about what's going on in a lot of places.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Julia. I think indeed that there is a growing, I think, a movement also even in the global South to see our fates are intertwined. There is no comfort for the global North without justice for the global South. I think there's no differentiating these two. And indeed, you're seeing the message spreading a little bit more. But at the same time, I think I personally see a bit of there might be a bit of fatigue with the climate movement, right? Like, so there might be different strands going on there. And there's a question in the Q&A that I think I'll ask to Maureen. Tasneem already kind of broached it. Like, as in, should social movements keep going to COP that is led by states and corporates? And the question is, how do we break loose from the processes that are only trying to reproduce capitalism to the detriment of the planet? I don't mean it as a fatalistic question, but really to ask, should we keep engaging with the COP? I think that's the key question.
Yeah, this is a present debate for the last, I think, 20 years at least, that we always discuss this point. I think there is a important part of the civil society that believe that of course, all the organizations, and especially related to a UN system, it's based on capitalism. So although they have also contradictions, so the contradictions that was used for these organizations to keep, for some reason, some small short gains, and for others to at least the things don't get worse. Also, the civil society do a role about transparency, monitoring, talk about how can this understand what's going inside these negotiations, because part of this is also implemented in the national policies and the national legislation. So if you don't know what's going on inside that, how can you also fight or push your government for different kind of opinion, or to understand better the picture how this decision that's taken about, for example, carbon market is in Article 6 of Paris Agreement be already implemented in the national legislation in Brazil domestically, and how can these contracts of carbon markets already been doing in the territories taking account this kind of the new international legislation. So there is a fact that it's useful also to understand what is it. And there is other that believe that you can gain some kind of victories or small victories inside the process. The loss and damage fund, it's one of the examples of the last recent years for a huge mobilization from civil society networks internationally to push for this fund. But everybody don't believe, I don't think there is anyone from civil society that really believe that this is the space that is from our dream, or this is the space of that we'll solve the problem, because we don't have, this is a big problem that we have right now. No, the international systems is a huge crisis. The basis that it was created is completely collapsing in the world that, that we live in, and there is a lack also of alternatives to discuss what is the world that you want to build multilaterally or internationally. So I think there is big questions related to that. In our case, we really believe that the popular movement that can do something outside is much more useful for us, although there is also dialogue between this space with the COP space. We are discussing yet how you be these strategies, but the dialogue is much more to criticize and to pressure inside the official space, also to expose the big fossil fuels, mining companies, and create and show up these contradictions, then because we agree what's happened inside, So I think we believe that it's still important to go and to keep pressure, but not our priority. Our priority, it's at least for this Brazilian organizations, not anymore this space for a while.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Maureen. So indeed, never to cede space, even if it might not be the primary place to operate, but to not give away the space, as Tasneem, I think, put it earlier. I've got a question for you, Lavinia, that's come on the chat. It's Leila Rekviashvili says she agrees with your suggestion on public and state ownership, but this is like the fact that governments might be directly investing in renewables, but once we look at particular states and governments that are otherwise very undemocratic, right-wing, and neoliberal, it is hard to believe that them running publicly owned energy infrastructures would do people or climate any good. So the question is, does it make sense to argue for public ownership in peripheral authoritarian states? Does that make a difference that it's an authoritarian state or it's a democratic state? I don't know if that's the key of the question, but Leila put it in the Q&A. What's your take?
Yeah, thanks so much for this very important question. I think it's important to address this. So let me give an example to show how this is still a fight that needs to be fought everywhere, regardless of the authoritarianism of your government. So we are collaborating closely with comrades in Tunisia, where the state of Tunisia is increasingly authoritarian and a right-out dictatorship. At the same time, there has been a struggle going on to fight the creeping and also more outright privatization of the electricity sector, and particularly renewables. So maybe to very quickly give this example, where the German government agency GIZ has set up shop, literally physically set up shop in the government of Tunisia. They are co-writing the energy transition laws and regulations of the country, so that now we see that agricultural land in Tunisia can be sold off to renewable private developers coming from Europe, and then export that as green hydrogen all back to the continent. Of course, this is clearly going at any energy sovereignty, any climate justice within Tunisia. And so the trade unions and civil society have been joining forces to fight back against that privatization. That, of course, has some responsibility by the Tunisian authoritarian state. But as this struggle goes on, they have been winning and reversing a private renewable installation that is now under the public utility. The workers are fighting to make a more public, more accountable public utility in Tunisia, and they're actually organizing to not just say the government should take over, but we want to have a public system that really supports community control, that supports cooperatives in the countryside. So this is also where my contribution kind of came from, to really see it as a dual power strategy where public and community really needs to hold, where the community needs to hold the public accountable, right? So hopefully that makes sense, and hopefully that example shows that it still makes a difference, and the struggle is just forever. And I don't know if is there still one single minute to kind of briefly respond to maybe some of the other panelists?
Yeah, real quickly.
Yeah, real quick. Well, I just thought it was very good to hear that, of course, this is not just a story about energy, but about democratization, our economies at large. So all our public services needs to be democratized in order to really have universal democratic provisioning systems. But since energy is so commodified in our mindsets, and since it's also the lifeblood of our political economy that is driving the climate crisis, I do think that needs to be prioritized to converge our struggles around, but also maybe to say and build on Tasneem's important input in terms of climate repression. When energy is nationalized and democratized and so on, that will face a lot of repression from the international community, just thinking of the Suez Channel in '56 and many others examples. So this is a struggle that will be fought back with all its might. But yeah, I do think that is what's at stake here and what is necessary.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lavinia. Our next question from the Q&A comes from Chiara Arena. And I would like to give it to you, Tasneem. How do you think that the climate justice movement should address increasing militarization and military imperialism around the world? Is it an opportunity to take a truly anti-imperialist approach? I think this is a very poignant question in this particular moment that we're in.
Thanks very much, and thanks for the question. Well, I think that, of course, the climate movement has to address militarization for very concrete reasons related to the climate. So we know that wars, and there's been the recent Guardian article, I'm sure people saw, where they calculated the emissions of the current, since October 2023 to date, the emissions of the war by Israel, the genocide by Israel. So there's a direct climate impact in terms of emissions when we have wars. There's that dimension. The other dimension is, of course, the cost of war. And so we all know that trillions are being spent to perpetuate wars, to perpetuate genocide. And we have a Trump that has called on, and it sounds like the Europeans are going to be open to this, to increase their budgets by 5% for military spending. And there's this move towards increasing, public spending. Essentially, that's what your budgets are all about, towards the military. And that then will, of course, crowd out all of the other needs for finance, whether that's the need for climate finance, whether that's the need to address all your developmental objectives, etc., etc. So certainly, in those two regards, of course, the climate movement has to take up an anti-militarization position, but it has to also take up an anti-militarization position out of pure principle. If we're fighting for climate justice, for a just world overall, and for peace as well. You certainly will not be wanting to transition to a world, a just and equitable world, where militarization is still a feature. So both on both fronts, a principled position, as well as the fact that, of course, it does contribute to climate emissions increasing, and of course distracting the finances from work that could have been done with the financing for climate. So yes, of course, we do need to. And the movements, there are movements doing this already, and that's exciting.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tasneem. I'd like to mention at this moment that, you know, this series, the Fractures series, is indeed about addressing what we have felt as a fundamental change in the global system. What we're seeing is the world as we know it is somewhat changing or falling apart. That's a general sentiment that has driven sort of like this series of teachings. But at the same time, understanding that moments of change and moments of crisis do present a few opportunities. And this is why we've come up with this series. So I'd like to ask in a brief lightning round from all our speakers, like, where are you seeing in this particular moment with the fractures that we're speaking about, where is the light coming in? What inspirational stories do you see? What has come across your field of view that makes you feel, okay, things will get better? So I'd like to ask Julia to start with this. Julia, where are the fractures and where's the light coming in from your perspective?
Sure, if it's light coming in, I really hope it is. I just wanted to mention that all our thoughts should be with the Gaza the Gaza flotilla and the ship that's currently carrying lots of people, including climate activists, most prominently Greta Thunberg. And yeah, I haven't looked at the news today. That's one of the things, the convergence of the struggles and the visible convergence that all good human beings should be fighting both of these fights together, I think is just vital.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Julia. Maureen, where's the light coming in from where you're standing?
I think the light is coming when we saw the solidarities coming from the civil society to Gaza all along the world, and this show up that you feel very without I don't know the word in English, but weak, very weak. What we can do related to that? No, I can do related to that, but you need to keep pushing. What you can do is go into the streets, going to push that. Don't stop talk about this. Don't stop to constrain the government. So the solidarity, although everything is falling apart, I think is the main hope that you can see that, because you can see yourself in the other, you know. And then this motivates us to keep going, to keep mobilizing, to keep pressure against the shrinking spaces and all this that you are seeing in this world, and keeping pushing for other kind of democracy that don't possibilitate this kind of genocide anymore. So I think is that. Thank you very much.
Thank
for
you so
the
much, Maureen.
opportunity.
Thank you. And Lavinia, where's the light coming from where you're standing?
Yeah, I think maybe the younger climate economic justice activists that are so much more bold, so much more powerful than the activists that that I was bringing up with alongside, and indeed the power that they have been bringing to fight the genocide, I think is extremely hopeful and extremely necessary, and to see how this has really led to the Petro administration stop exporting coal to fuel the genocide. We know that just so many governments are maybe paying lip service, or at least some countries are paying lip service to condemn Israel for these genocidal actions. At the same time, many are continuing to fuel it with power, with arms, and so on. So that also more recently, all this grassroots pressure from around the world led then also Spain to stop an arms deal. when we see really policies changing, even though it hasn't really stopped the genocide in what way or form, I think that is very, very powerful. So yeah, thanks for bringing it to that, Julia.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lavinia. And Tasneem, where is the light coming in from where you're standing?
I will need to agree with all my fellow panelists. I think the light is actually coming through the resistance of people, and the resistance that continues, actually, even though there's violent repression, and especially the young people, as you say, Lavinia. So that standing in solidarity, the resistance against, the genocide, the fact that they're doing this in the face of unbelievable repression across the world, that is the light. And I think the additional feature of this is that because things have been made so visible, the system that can allow for genocide to happen in this way, the consciousness and awareness of the systems that drives these injustices, genocide, etc., that consciousness is so clear and aware. So it's not, resistance for the sake of it. It is really understanding also the system and why we need to continue this resistance. And that, to me, it's always the power of people that will be the light for us, I think.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you. A very big thank you to all our speakers for your really amazing insights and for giving us a better way of understanding this current moment. Very much gratitude to the team behind the scenes, Nick, Jess, the whole TNI machine, and also our partners, Noor, the Alternative Information Development Center, the Global Network of Movement Lawyers, and the Asia-Europe People's Forum, and all the other people that have come together to help us create this moment to understand exactly where the world stands today. If you found any sort of value from this, please consider a donation to any of the organizations that are involved. We are in a particularly dangerous moment for any progressive organizations, as there is a concerted effort, as we've even heard from today's session, to really undermine our work and to push back against this amazing coming together of people to create a more just, equitable world. This session has been recorded and will be shared to everybody who registered. Next week, we have an amazing panel that's going to build on this session to look more closely and more broadly at how social movements can resist and win. We'll be joined by Chanel Matthews, who's the founder of Radical Communicators Network and co-editor of forthcoming Framing New Worlds. Nimi Gaurinathan, who is an activist, writer, and scholar and founder of the Politics of Sexual Violence Initiative, and Tuba Syed, who is a feminist labor organizer from Pakistan. Please spread the word, share with all your friends. Do please consider a donation. And as always, let us remember the people of Palestine. Let us remember the people who are suffering all across the world, the people in Congo, the people in Sudan. Let us remember all the reasons why we do what we do. This is not just talk. These are real struggles, working peoples fighting against a system of injustice and fighting against a system that removes the dignity of human life. Thank you so much for joining us today, and make sure that you join us next week as we go to the final 2 sessions of our Teach In series. Much appreciated to everyone, and peace and love to everyone. Thank you.